Okay, so I'm going to add a podcast here under new findings based on a report that just came out of the University of Manchester, which is cited here. We have looked at global warming targets and emission gaps, where the current policies take us, where NDCs take us, where there are conditional, unconditional NDCs, and the emission gaps to 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees centigrade targets. This report goes in a slightly different way. It takes the integrated assessment models and takes all the oil, coal, and gas producers and makes some assumptions and tries to come up with phase-out pathways for fossil fuels to be consistent with the global warming targets. So it's an interesting approach, interesting results. So I'm going to just include it again very briefly. So you have to go and read the report if you want to get all the details of the assumptions that go into this. Seems a little prescriptive, and they stick to this idea of number of years left to meet the carbon gap, emission gap, which social scientists oppose, as I will show in a minute. For this research report, 3 scenarios based on AR6 carbon budgets have been selected to represent. So the report involves around 3 core scenarios based on different probabilities of not exceeding 1.5 degrees C and 1.7 degrees C by 2100 with respect to the Industrial Revolution, with different probabilities. A 50% chance of staying within 1.7 degrees C. This budget also gives a greater than 83% chance of staying within 2 degrees C as per the Paris Agreement. Very good. 50% chance of staying within or stabilizing at 1.5 degrees C. A 67% chance of staying within or stabilizing at 1.5 degrees C. I'm aware that there is a construction noise that's going on outside, but it's really hot today, so I'm going to leave the window open and see if the quality of sound is good enough. Okay, the headline budgets in AR6 are for all global CO2 emissions from the start of 2020 onwards, to cover the rest of the 21st century and beyond. Since this report is just coming out in 2022, they do some adjustments for 2020-2021 emissions with respect to AR6. So here are the scenarios: 50% chance of 1.7 degrees C, 50% chance of 1.5 degrees C, and 67% of 1.5 degrees C. So what AR6 estimated in terms of remaining carbon emissions, and what this report adjusts it to, removing the 2020-2021 emissions that already occurred or estimated to have occurred, less the cement process emissions, so that goes into the fossil fuel budget as well, and years left at current emissions rate. So this has been stated as the number of years left to save ourselves and so on, which is not a language that everybody agrees with, especially social scientists, and I also tend to disagree with this kind of idea of saying that's how much time we have left to save the planet, because there are lots of uncertainties in the carbon budget and we are not always 100% sure of just what will happen when we exceed 1.7 degrees C or 1.5 degrees C in terms of saving ourselves. So without getting alarmistic about it, it's pretty obvious that if you lower the global warming target, the amount of carbon you can emit goes down, and if you increase the probability with which you want to hit that target, then it further reduces the amount of carbon you can emit. And if you take out the 2020-2021 emissions, then these numbers go down respectively as well by various amounts. And cement emissions again add to the carbon budget, so they have to be taken out as well, which further reduces these numbers. And using the current emission rates, we can estimate the number of years it will take us to emit the amount that we are estimating for meeting these global warming targets. So global emissions budgets and key adjustments under 3 scenarios, all budget values in billion tons of CO2 or gigatons CO2. The budget for 50% chance of 1.7 degrees C is again the same as 83% chance of 2 degrees C under Paris Agreement. This report also makes assumptions about BECCS bioenergy, carbon capture and sequestration, carbon dioxide removal, and so on, in terms of whether they are realistic in terms of the integrated assessment models' reliance on those approaches to meet some of these targets. So you have to go through the report to see those kinds of details. There is less than 10 years worth of current emissions remaining for a 50% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C. So this language is more realistic and scientific in terms of carbon budget and global warming targets, instead of saying we have only 10 years left to save ourselves. Okay, obviously there are these stylized pathways or scenarios with the same end year here can be very different, but obviously the area under the cover corresponds to the cumulative emissions by 2050, which means the actual warming is going to be very different, because it's the cumulative accumulation of carbon that determines the warming. There is a linear relationship between accumulated carbon and the warming. Strikingly, different budgets and pathways can have the same end date. The climate is sensitive only to the cumulative emission or budget. Okay, so we have to remember that. Thus, the envelope of viable pathways for a given budget with a given 0 year is effectively constrained by the imperatives of ensuring an ecologically sustainable energy supply for the post-fossil fuel era. So it's the condition is that if we phase out fossil fuel, we have something that replaces in an ecologically sustainable manner, ensuring a just transition for those whose livelihoods currently depend on fossil fuel extraction. So those people have to be retrained and re-employed elsewhere, ensuring viable and ecologically sustainable pathways broadly consistent with the tenets of CBDRRC, which is common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. So this distinguishes the burden of removing carbon from the developing and developed countries, giving them appropriate financial transfer, which is now basically considered inevitable, in addition to developed countries doing more rapid and earlier drawdown of carbon. Okay, so the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities makes plain that developed countries with greater socio-economic capacity to mitigate should make both bigger and earlier steps to decarbonize than developing countries which have lesser capacity for the same. Moreover, the principle requires that developed countries provide financial support to enable developing countries to implement effective mitigation while continuing to pursue sustainable development and poverty eradication. So the principle of equity dictates that developed countries with the greatest abilities to decarbonize should make both bigger and sooner emissions reductions than developing countries. Very important, and yet it's not clear how this can be implemented, considering what has happened with the pandemic and the Ukrainian war, Russian invasion of Ukraine, and so on. So any socio-economic perturbation, geopolitical perturbation, tends to put climate action on the back burner, as is obvious by now. So obviously those are big ifs in the scenarios. In terms of share of global emissions budget by fossil fuel type at baseline and under 3 temperature-based scenarios. The baseline is 2018. Look at the share of total emissions in 2018. Coal at 41%, oil at 38%, and gas at 21%. The main message is that for any of the 3 scenarios, coal will not be allowed to go above its 2018 level, whereas oil and gas will be adjusted to meet the phase-out pathways. So coal is going to be aggressively reduced, as is already been advocated by AR6, and this report sticks to those requirements that coal must be phased out. Leaving the assets in ground is difficult, and there are assumptions here that if fossil fuel like oil and gas are extracted, then they will be burned. So phasing out means stopping the extraction. There is no way we will leave the extracted assets like oil and gas remain unburned. Okay, you can imagine probably that coal will be extracted but will be left in a museum or in a coal park just to demonstrate the problem we were creating, but that's not the case for oil and gas. Okay, so the calculations basically showed the phase-out pathways for fossil fuel production. This is for coal production. So coal production phase-out pathways and respective budgets for developed and developing countries under 3 temperature scenarios. So this is 50% probability of 1.7 degrees C. If we hit the functional 0 year of 2050 from 2018 baseline, then this is the emission pathway, which is different than these, as we will see in a minute. Excuse me, sorry. This is in terms of gigaton CO2 per year. If the functional 0 year is 2031, obviously we will have to phase it out fairly quickly. For another target of 50% probability of 1.5 degrees C warming scenario, we have a faster drawdown for both functional 0 year of 2040 and 2030. And similarly, if we up the probability to 67%, then we need to drop down relatively fast. Functional 0 year has to go to 2037, and for this one has to go to 2030 in terms of developed and developing countries. So developed countries have to drop out much faster than developing countries in both cases, and these are the pathways provided by these calculations. Okay, so the coal pathway for a 50% chance of 1.7 degrees C are slightly different from the pathways for 1.5 degrees C budgets, in that developing countries' emissions from coal productions are held constant from 2022 until 2025. So they are given some room to adjust their phase outs when they begin their decline, essentially a delayed peak year. This gives the characteristic humped shape of the stacked area chart that we see here. Okay, so global CO2 production, global CO2 production budgets for coal and oil and gas combined in the 3 core scenarios. Budget in gigaton CO2 for 50% probability of 1.7 degrees C warming. Coal has 249 gigatons, oil and gas together have 422. If we reduce the global warming target to 1.5 C, the budget shrink quite rapidly here, almost almost 50%, and in both cases. And if we increase the probability of wanting to hit 1.5 degrees C, that budget shrinks further. So obviously these are budgets as of January 22, but obviously we will have lesser and lesser room to emit carbon as we want to hit stricter and stricter global warming targets. Okay, so this is just a way in which the countries that produce oil and gas are ranked either by top producers or share of national GDP, and producers by non-oil GDP per cap, or the ranking by non-oil GDP per capita, purchasing power parity of 2019 in US dollars, and by global production, top 33 by global percent of global production, and dependence on oil and gas. So there are rich oil producers like United States, which has a much smaller dependence on income from fossil fuel production, whereas there are other countries which rely much more on income from oil and gas. So these are considered in weighing the various phase out pathways, and they are ranked in this way, where you are looking at non-oil GDP per capita, purchasing power parity 100,000 current US dollars, and group 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are based on highest capacity, high capacity, medium capacity, low capacity, and lowest capacity. So you can see how the phase out is grouped. So grouping of producer country by non-oil GDP per capita, which allows them to assign phase outs based on their economic capacities to be able to phase out oil and gas. Obviously, you cannot just impose phasing out unless you provide alternative incomes for those countries that rely on oil and gas income, right? So altogether, phase out pathways for fossil fuel productions, combined oil and gas, for the 5 groups of countries under 3 core temperature scenarios. So these are the 5 groups by colors, and these are the 3 targets. Again, the main thing is that the rich countries have to phase out quicker for each scenario, and the target functional 0 year gets earlier and earlier as we increase the stringency of the global warming targets that we want to hit. Okay, the main messages are basically that for a 50% chance of not exceeding 1.5 degrees C, less than 10 years worth of emission space remains at current levels of production. This is not including the Earth system feedback, which may provide a strong negative feedback and allow more room for carbon, or could be a net positive feedback with warming and shrink the room remaining. So that has to be kept in mind. For a 50% chance of not exceeding 1.5 degrees C, coal production needs to be phased out in developed countries by 2030 and in developing countries by 2040. Oil and gas producing nations differ greatly in their dependence on income from production. Some of the poorest producers have very little income other than from oil and gas. Wealthier producers tend to have much more diversified economies, even when they are major producers of oil and gas, which allows them to phase out much more rapidly and play their role in common but differentiated responsibilities. Wealthier producers are still wealthy even when their revenue from oil and gas is removed. These are kind of the assumptions, honestly. For a 50% chance of 1.5 degrees C, the wealthiest producers or group 1 need to end production of oil and gas by 2034, while the poorest producers, which are group 5, have until 2050. Our findings suggest that the current proposals by governments of virtually all oil and gas producing nations place the world on course for exceeding 1.5 degrees C. For a 50% chance or a 50% or better chance of staying below 1.5 degrees C, production must start to reduce everywhere. There is no room in a 1.5 degrees C budget for any expansion of oil and gas production. In other words, we have already hit our peak production. There is a concept of peak oil as to when we may reach the exploitable reserves, but now this is saying that's not the option. That's not an option at all. That peak production is already past. There is not enough space left in the 1.5 degrees C global budget to be fully equitable in the treatment of poorest producers through later phase-out dates alone. Financial transfers will be essential to help poorer producers transition from oil and gas production quickly enough to stay below 1.5 degrees C. As I said before, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is already playing out many of the scenarios in terms of dependent countries, in terms of energy, like India, making all sorts of deals possible to protect themselves against oil shocks from the invasion. So geopolitics plays into all these sorts of actions that become necessary for surviving, let alone for growing economically. But we already know that geopolitical and socio-economic perturbations like the pandemic and wars will always push the climate agenda to the back burner. So how to stay focused and sustain the climate action is not an easy problem to solve. Nonetheless, having these sorts of model simulations, integrated assessment model simulations for phase-out pathways of fossil fuels adds to the emission gaps ideas that we have been discussing. How to implement these, of course, remains to be seen. Okay, so let's leave this here and then see what other new results we will keep finding under climate change science, climate change modeling, and climate solutions.